So, listener, hello, Twinny. Now, technically, I suppose you're sort of unemployed. Now you've had your last working day at NSPCC, and you're wondering, you already look bored and fed up. Only
Yes.
joking, you really aren't.
Yes.
How are you finding it?
Not very different at the moment. It feels like I'm on a sort of long weekend or a week off preparing for Christmas. So there's plenty to do. In fact, I've actually dodged taking 2 of the cats to the vet this afternoon, who have an appointment kind of around about now. So rather than chasing the cats around the house, I've come out here to record this podcast. But this is the domesticity which I will become used to for about another 3 weeks, and then you're right, I'll probably be bored stiff and looking to do all sorts of things in the new year.
Oh, brilliant, Peter. And actually, talking of like the run up to Christmas, so you see that I'm in this like this little hat, a Santa hat on my head, and this little jumper. We have a wellbeing team at DSC, and they're always telling us what to do. Like to be well and healthy. It's very irritating. Like get outside, get some fresh air. I prove it by taking photos.
Yeah,
Actually,
that's
I laugh. Well, the staff love it. They absolutely love it. They think it's great fun and all the rest of it. Anyway, our task today was to wear a Christmas jumper and a Christmas hat. Now, I love Christmas, but I absolutely hate Christmas jumpers. I don't own one, and I was not going to go out and buy one just specially. So I cheated, tiny little knitted borrower-sized jumper, like wearing it like a brooch attached to me. And I will go to my grave saying, this counts as wearing a Christmas jumper. I'm technically wearing it, even if it's not covering my entire body. And I see you have a festive jumper on as well, Peter.
I am sporting the Lidl Christmas jumper, which has become a legend in their adverts, and available from your local Lidl. £1 of the proceeds go to the NSPCC. So not only am I advertising a fantastic charitable partnership, but encouraging people to spend money for a good cause, and it's quite lively this year. It's a very kind of vivid red. So yes, pleasure to wear that.
That's this year's one.
That's this year's. Yes, I've got. I could have lent you a little Christmas jumper. In fact, I could have lent you any number of 30 or so outfits that I've worn down the ages in Christmas dressing up challenges of one sort or another.
Well, you would have been wasting your time, Peter, because I would have refused point blank to wear them. I don't like to wear things that look stupid on me.
how miserable. I mean, I can't think of anything more stressful than forced fun, but at the same time, I don't mind a Christmas jumper.
Yeah. Well, lots of our staff rebelled, of course. They didn't. And when I say they made us, of course they didn't. It was an invitation, but yeah. Anyway, so this, of course, is our last podcast before Christmas. We'll be back on the 9th, and we'll remind listeners at the end. And I was thinking, I like up until this morning, I thought, I don't really have anything to moan about. And then I read an article in The Guardian about how Rachel Reeves is encouraging, or is going to create this kind of like little group of business people to go into the government departments and have a look at efficiency and costs and things like that. And whilst on the one hand, I think that's a fantastic idea. I think external input is always helpful. It's really good to have other eyes looking. I'm absolutely outraged that we weren't asked. And the thing that I find, the sector, the charitable sector, and the thing I find most staggering about it is if there's a sector in our society that cannot afford to waste a penny. I mean, there's little waste. Of course there is in some areas, because waste is a necessary part of systems. But there's so little waste. We have to maximise every single penny we get. We're kind of the opposite in an economy. We're kind of the opposite economic model. So the more the economy suffers, the more demand for our services go up, and the less money we're able to raise. So we have to be really, really clever and sharp and on it. And I think most of us are bloody experts in maximising the resource and producing fantastic services. And so I'm just really surprised, and if I'm honest, incredibly disappointed that they haven't invited us in. And also puts into question for me again, they've said they're committed to the covenant. I want to believe them, but it's another test that they failed, which is, bring us in at those levels. Anyway, so that's what I'm ranting and feeling very cross about today, or disappointed. Yeah.
Yes, I know what you mean about this kind of it can only be the commercial sector that knows how to use resource wisely, and some of the most extraordinary wastes and scandals of money come from the private sector, without a doubt. So at the same time as them bringing in these fantastic business people are going to save lots of money, they're going chasing after the business people who took them for a ride over the PPE contracts and everything else. So there is this sort of default to only people who are needing to kind of turn a pound to make profit are the ones who know how to use resource wisely. I did, though, read a speech by Pat McFadden earlier this week about public service reform and how they are looking to deliver services more efficiently and more effectively, including through the use of tech. And I thought we had some really good examples there, actually, of the way in which services, particularly online services, iterate, learn fast, and deliver better and better. Test on a small scale and then scale up quickly. And some of those disciplines, I don't know if I got my passport renewed recently, and he mentions that as a service that was kind of on the floor and has now been turned around. I don't know if that was a result of bringing in people from the private sector or just great tech people who are transforming services in the public sector. But I did think that was a kind of good example of step change transformation in efficiency, and we could do with some of that. And in fact, we do talk to people in and around Childline, for example, about how can we achieve, how can the NSPCC, that place where I used to work, spend more time listening to and engaging with the children and less time recording and administering the contacts that they make. And I think there's a lot to learn there from the people who kind of know and understand how to deliver modern services. So I suppose it depends a little bit on quite what these people are going to come in and do and who they are. But as you say, making a lot from a little is kind of what we do in our sector.
The interesting for me is the government, the state sector has more in common with the charitable sector than it ever does with the business sector. It's like there's kind of like they're almost like hypnotized by the glamour of businesses. But the reality is that the public sector isn't there to make money, just as we're not there to make money. The public sector is there to use the resources it's got in service of the public and to deliver on the government's priorities. And so, for example, lots of the things that businesses can talk about, like financial instruments, like leveraging capital investment or loans or overdrafts or whatever those things are, we don't have access to that, or at least not in the same scale in our sector. Our ability to, we can't pass on costs to a consumer. We have to find a way to manage and all those things. And so again, I still wonder what perspective of a business. And it's also, and I also kind of think it's a bit of a myth that businesses are really super efficient. I'm not sure that they are, because in precisely those things that we said. I mean, okay, Thames Water is a very, very extreme case in point, admittedly, but they to make their look good by faffing about with a blooming balance sheet. You know what I mean? And like by well, don't want to go into the detail of it. Plus, I can't really remember all the detail of it. But the point I'm making is that you can make a thing look good by messing things around without actually adding value or actually generating revenue to the bottom line. And I think that's very much the case here, is that companies look efficient because they're generating profits, but actually when you start to dig deeper, what they've done is they've done a price rise, or they've cut a whole load of staff, which increases profit, but it's not necessarily about efficiency. Sometimes they're just so anyway, it just frustrates me. And I'm not in the private sector. We need the private sector. We need them to employ people and to raise taxes and all the rest of it. So it's not an anti-business rant, this, but it's more that I don't understand why we're not seen as having at least equal value and at least an equal amount of input into the way government runs. And because we are way more similar, because we're about serving people and not making money.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for a lot of these services, the currency is social impact, isn't it? What's the difference you can achieve from the money as opposed to anything else? And that's what we are seeking to do. Mind you, our sector is its own worst enemy sometimes, in that reporting of our sector, where when we bring out our annual report and accounts, the only thing most of the sector magazines are interested in is what's the income been in a particular year, as opposed to what have you achieved with that income, which is what really matters. So
excellent point. I think I might have a word with our major sector publications about that, because actually that's a really that's a really good point. But I think that's because human nature is, what's the turnover? How much money are they bringing, without actually ever really understanding. Also, I find it really interesting about, like, talking about reserves in our sector, how incredibly misunderstood reserves are, and how, because if you think about, I think about small charities in particular. So a small charity can look as if it's quite well off because it's got, I don't know, £100,000 reserves, and it's like a £500,000 charity. But that £100,000 reserves is hardly ever cash. It's almost all, it'll be a wheelchair or some beds or a van, or not a van, a people carrier to transport people around. In other words, it's an asset on the books, but if you sell the asset, you can't do the work. So it doesn't really mean an enormous amount. It's not like having assets that you can sell. Like, I've got a whole load of stuff in a warehouse that I could, take down the market in Hoyt. That's not what we've got in our reserves. And I think we need to have a more grown-up, sensible conversation, particularly with funders and the media, about how they report on the reserves that we've got, because very few of us have reserves that are realisable. Most of our reserves, for most of us in the sector, are only useful to us if we go into administration. They're not things that we can sell as we go along to keep ourselves going or to raise cash for the most part. So, yeah. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, so when I moved from the public sector into the charitable sector, I was impressed at the sophistication of the work that went into the calculations of whether or not we were a going concern, and the diligence with which the treasurer and the trustees looked at those matters and challenged us on that, and distinguished, as you say, between the different sorts of money that were available to the charity, whether that was immediately cashable or an asset that was needed for the delivery of the service, or something that in a really distressed situation could be put to use. So again, to take the NSPCC as an example, it owns the freehold on Western House in Shoreditch, which is a lovely asset to have that has appreciated over time. But whilst there's still, and we have talked about remote working and headquarters buildings and so on, but while there's still a case for bringing people together, it's not a bad place to bring people together, and it has significant value for the charity. So you wouldn't kind of start off with selling it. But distinguishing between the nature of the different assets, I think, matters, and recognizing, I think it's reasonable of funders to take a look at the extent to which charities are using their resources either to secure their resilience to be able to operate into the medium and longer term, if what they're seeking to achieve has a time frame of that nature, but is otherwise spending to deliver impact. I mean, it was never part of in my strategy to accumulate properties in order to rent them out to make money to do something. All of that seems a kind of means to an end, as opposed to the fundamental focus on the charitable purpose. But all of that needs thought, and it's a bit more, all of it is more kind of complicated and something that you have to have regard to as a third sector leader, compared with when you sit in Whitehall and the taxpayers' money rolls in. Now, it's not to say I was ever cavalier with resource. I spent the first 10 years of my life in the Treasury, and I was probably far too much of a tightwad. But it is different when you've got to think about income and expenditure.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true, isn't it? Which brings me actually to, thinking about reserves and using up assets and stuff like that, because I was having a conversation with somebody the other day who are facing debt. I mean, actually, a conversation I've had with most of my colleagues in the sector are about deficit budgets and years moving forward. So that's no surprise. But talking about, the balance between you can manage if you cut a service, or you could sell an asset, because some are in the position of having assets that they could sell. And we were having the conversation about the balance of that. And I think I was making the point that the whole point about reserves in our sector is that they are there for purpose. And in fact, in law, we're not supposed to build up massive amounts of reserves. We're supposed to use the money that we have or the assets that we've got in service of the work that we do. So there's no shame at all. Because people say selling off the family silver, we can't do that. And I'm like, what's the point of family silver stuck in a cupboard that you don't use and is no use to you? Like, sell it if you need it. That's the whole thing about reserves, isn't it?
Definitely. If it's not adding to your future resilience or your ability to do the job well.
Yeah.
I would argue that the headquarters of NSPC at the moment has been adding significant value to the charity's ability to do that. Someone might take a different view in due course, and if it's an area of London which is
very
valuable, and so over time one might take a different decision and choose to be based somewhere else or not have a base. But that I would distinguish that from being gifted a property in someone's will and using it to accumulate, speculate on the property market, as opposed to using those resources to help children now.
Yeah, I get the point. I think because it brings me to infrastructure. Actually, infrastructure, the least most glamorous, most overlooked, most unloved part of our sector, because we're not front line. We're serving charities who serve others. And infrastructure, of course, massively struggle for funding. When charities struggle for funding, we have the double whammy, because we have the knock-on effect of that. And our ability, because funders don't like funding infrastructure, it's almost impossible to get the general public to donate for infrastructure. And yet when it goes, it can be catastrophic for the charities concerned, who rely on infrastructure for their support, for their policy access, for the particularly smaller charities where they don't have the time or resources themselves to do that work. They rely on the infrastructure, which is why I was like gutted to see GMCVO. So listeners, those of you who don't know, Greater Manchester Voluntary Community Organisation, been around for decades, really, really powerful player in the Manchester area, and have done so much for charities and local groups and community groups over the years, and networked and created relationships, and then finally just ran out of money and couldn't get the resources that they needed to keep going, so they've been forced to close down. And I always sort of feel, like, you're always sad when any charity closes, to be honest, because nobody wants to see a charity close. But I do understand my peers in the infrastructure sector, their frustration and their fear, because nobody wants to fund us. We don't have members at DSC, which personally is for us is a good thing, because that's one of the reasons why we're able to be as open and as outspoken and as in your face as we are, because nobody's funding us. And we don't have members to please, so we can say what we believe to be true and right on our opinion. So we're lucky in that. But most of the others, they get some resources from running membership models. But the trouble with membership models, of course, is that not all members agree. I went to a dinner the other week with a few of the permanent secretaries and some senior folk at DCMS. And it was really interesting when somebody made the point that you cannot ask us to speak with one voice. It's nonsense to say that. You've got in the leadership body, you've got, people who are campaigning for the natural environment and people who are campaigning for houses to be built, and very often they will completely clash and disagree. So, and if you don't have those bodies in existence to make the cases and to manage those arguments, it becomes more challenging. And also, given that our sector is so big, infrastructure tends to be the most efficient way for local authorities and or the state to engage with the wider sector, because we can do the work, we've got the access, whereas you can't as a government department pick off every single individual charity that's working in your particular sector. I mean, can you imagine, if education, for example, Peter, had to speak to every single children's charity? Just wouldn't happen. You have to have, and you yourselves have a coalition, don't you, of children's charities? I'm whittering on, but I think it's incredibly sad, and I'm just frustrated that people don't value infrastructure more.
Yeah, I think when it comes to mission-led government and solving some of these big challenges in a joined-up way, as the government is aspiring to do, and talk's a good talk on connecting up the sectors and problem solving with one another, then where you give voice to our sector in those conversations is really difficult. In some ways, I think people are slightly more interested in talking to me now I'm not belonging to a particular charity than when I did. Because when I did, there was a slight, until we developed this kind of coalition, there was, oh, we've talked to NSPCC, so we better bring in Bernardo's, we better bring, before you know it, you've got one of these great sort of round tables where you have very little chance to make your point. But in place-based work, I would have thought that if they're doing their job well, infrastructure organisations across the wider conurbations like Manchester could have a vital role to play if they've got a connection and understanding to the groups which haven't got the kind of bandwidth or ability to talk for themselves or represent themselves in those sorts of conversations. So yeah.
I mean, what gives me hope, though, always, is that the interesting thing for me that I've noticed over all my decades of working in this sector is that when one organisation closes, another one leaps up. I give it a year max, and there'll be a new version of a infrastructure body for Manchester in one way, shape, or form that will start small and have to build again. And it's a shame because all that capital, that human capital, that social capital, that intellectual capital is all gets dissipated. But nonetheless, and we've seen this over and over again. It's like, Peter, the charity register is really stable. Roughly 6,000 to 8,000 charities a year die, and roughly 6,000 to 8,000 charities a year are born. It's almost like we've reached equilibrium, and it's sort of very balanced. And every time you see one charity close down, you absolutely guarantee that another one will spring up. I've seen it also with mergers. If mergers really were the answer to everything, we'd have much fewer charities. But that's not what happens, because when those charities that do successfully merge, which is rare, to be fair, they're often more of a challenge than people expect. When they do merge, all that happens is a smaller one pops up to replace the one that merged, and I've seen that over and over and over again. So the one thing I do know is, even that if individual charities die, new ones will be born, and there will be things to replace them. But it's just tough, really.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about the particular circumstances of this closure, but some might argue that there's attraction in closure and starting out. I mean, there's a loss, as you say, if knowledge is lost and relationships and connections are severed. That's a bad thing. If it brings in fresh thinking and
Fresh
new
ideas,
and a kind of energy and a kind of source of funding that's determined to do something because it feels urgent, then maybe that creates a momentum when people were previously drifting. I don't know.
So what do you think about 2025, Peter? Any predictions for next year?
For the sector,
Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to be a challenging time because of the additional fixed costs which so many charities are going to have to absorb just to stand still. So that is going to be a more challenging budget and planning round than people expected, and I think that will have an impact on levels of activity in the short term. But the the flip side of that is the interest in addressing some of the big problems which we've been kind of banging the table and keen to get involved in for some time. So I guess it's how that plays out, really, and if the sector individually and collectively does get voice in the problem solving that the government is setting out to do, I think there could be some exciting times ahead.
Yeah, and that's something we'll definitely keep banging on about. It's like, so I was saying I went to this dinner with some other colleagues from the civil society group, and what was really interesting, Peter, that has never happened, well, at least it may have happened, but not that I've ever been aware of, is that we had 4 permanent secretaries at that dinner. 4. and several very senior people, from within DCMS, and a chap who I refer to as some bloke from the Home Office, who I feel really bad about, but somebody terribly senior in the Home Office as well. And what was really encouraging for me was that they turned up in their own time in an evening, and what that said to me there's definitely a commitment here. There's a change of, we couldn't even get to see our own permanent secretary, in previous years. Never mind about four of them sat together on this table, and it was quite a small, intimate thing. It wasn't a big shingy bangy event. It was quite small, and it was really heartening. It actually did fill me with hope, because even though they keep failing, so they keep forgetting to include us in stuff, they keep forgetting the impact of some of the stuff they're doing. I think that's going to take time to change, but I definitely felt a real sea change, a real willingness to engage in a very different attitude and approach. And I think, so I actually genuinely feel really hopeful about that. I mean, the mere fact you've got people in a room talking and listening begins a process of change, doesn't it? So I actually feel quite hopeful about that. And I think we will see more concerted engagement next year from government with the sector. I think that we will see them think, oh shit, we really mustn't forget that lot, because they've got something quite useful to add here. So I genuinely do think that's going to come, because I can see it. And also, much better than I do, Peter, because you've obviously actually worked in that environment. But it seems to me that ministers come and go, but permanent secretaries tend to be permanent, or permanent-ish. They tend to stay for a while. And so therefore you've got that kind of corporate history. You've got that sort of, and if a new minister comes in, they're able to say, here's the briefing, here's the state of affairs, here's what we're finding working.
Yeah, I think that probably underplays the influence that ministers can have relative to permanent secretaries. Actually, I think, but yeah, I wondered. There was good news last week in the appointment of the new cabinet secretary. In my view, I don't know if you had a chance to chat to him at my leaving party. He was there, Sir Chris Wormold. Yeah.
Oh no, I didn't.
You missed an opportunity there. You see, everyone was at that party. He wasn't wearing as spectacular shoes as you or me. So we'll need to do something about that. But yeah, he's one of my oldest friends from Department of Education days. We used to hang around in an office on the 3rd floor and put the world to rights on a pretty regular basis. And now, poor chap, he's got the opportunity really to do it. In fact, the responsibility to do it. So good luck to Chris. And I think, yeah, I may need to keep my head down in the kind of early weeks of 2025 and his tenure there, in case he sort of some great kind of ethics issue arises. And he says
that,
yeah.
Yes.
I don't want to too difficult too quickly.
Do you think it's likely you'll get sucked back into that main government world, Peter?
I don't know. I'm not interested in doing anything full time in that space. But if there are an interesting and important tasks to be done that they feel I have some relevant expertise to do, and I think are exciting and interesting, then yeah, I'd be up for thinking about it. The key is to have really clear terms of reference and to have a time frame to take on anything like that. And lots of the commissions that come out of government, I think, are rather sort of by and large and open-ended. And before you know it, you've signed up to something which there are completely different views about the kind of nature and scale of. So I think, like any contract, it's important to be clear about what the expectations are and the timeframes. But I might have a bit of time on my hands between other bits and pieces. You never know.
Yeah,
as long as it didn't interfere with cricket too much.
Yeah, I was so interested to see what you end up getting sucked into next year, Peter, because you will undoubtedly be in demand. It'd just be so interesting to see which you never know. Our podcast might take off, and we might become super famous, Peter. You never know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I'm famous, because people are a bit mean to famous people, aren't they? And I don't like people being mean to me. It upsets me.
Oh dear, no, not looking for a huge kind of profile as a podcaster, but You never know. We know the Daily
You never
Mail
know.
listen from time to time, don't they?
Yeah. Did you ever do Question Time?
No.
It's another one of my massive frustrations, actually, is like, because most of the chief executives that I know, of all charities actually, but I'm particularly notable in some of the larger charities that are dealing with at the real core of some big problems, are incredibly well informed. I mean, you can't run NSBCC or Oxfam or Save the Children or Alzheimer's or anything like that without being very politically aware, without having a really good understanding of the economy and what's going on in it, without having a really good grasp of what the wider issues are, and who can speak about it incredibly articulately. Is that a word? Articulately. Well, anyway, it'll do. And yet we hardly ever get invited on. I know, what's his name? Javid Khan, Bernardo's, he was on there once, I remember. And
Yeah, and
Danny
Danny from
Oxfam,
Oxfam.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
the Sheila McKechnie Foundation have done a piece of work, haven't they, to try and promote
Yeah,
the contribution that civil society leaders can make. And there was a collection of essays which came out a couple of weeks ago. I know uh, my successor, Chris Sherwood, he wrote one of them about Sector Mark Russell from the Children's Society, another. I mean,
yeah,
we got there are some great people who could contribute to those conversations without a doubt. I've always felt up to today slightly institutionally constrained by the charitable purpose and the
yeah,
organisation, and I think it's difficult when you are responsible for and associated with a brand that's as precious as the NSPCC to
yeah,
um, funny and frivolous, and
yeah.
because the nuance gets lost in those frames. But that becomes more of an opportunity, I think, looking forwards for me personally.
Absolutely. It's now not there anymore. You're able to speak about your experience in government, your experience in treasury, in education, in funding, in children. It's like you would have so much to offer. I might start a campaign, get
Oh,
Peter on Question Time.
I'd have to start reading the papers again.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to do that. Bonuses of retirement. You don't have to keep up with what's going on in the world anymore.
No, I hope not.
I
So,
think
what are you
we're
doing for Christmas?
usual stuff, family and friends, people over, parents for Christmas Day. I come from, as you know, I come from this massive Anglo-Indian Catholic background. Not that any of us are particularly, well, we don't particularly practice the faith. I don't have any faith at all, but there's this massive family. And there are about 54 of us in total, because my mother's one of seven and I'm one of four. And, there's just like, so then there's cousins and nieces and nephews and, Miriam, I know there's about 54 of us all together. And we tend to try to all get together on Boxing Day every year. My grandmother instituted it when we were very young, and her kids were just leaving home and having their kids. And we've just kept it going even since my grandparents died. So we all gather, usually at my little tiny house, we cram everybody in. But my brother's doing it at his this year. So that's something I always look forward to. The in-laws are always less keen. Those of us who have partners, the partners are always like, oh God, because we're very loud, very in your face. When you grow up in a big, noisy, extended family, you tend to be quite a big, noisy, because that's the only way you can get heard. So that's good fun. I mean, it's rare that we have the whole 54. There's usually about 35 or 40, but they're close. They're cousins and the children of cousins and things like that. So that's always good fun. How about you?
Oh, that's good. Well, I'm going to spend the mornings watching cricket from Australia, the evenings watching the darts, and I'm going to be sociable in the afternoons, up to a point. I think that's my Christmas.
Oh, brilliant. Actually, talking of which, we haven't managed to watch any of it because of the blooming contract is with some remote TV production company. So we're not seeing any of the cricket on any of the mainstream TV or Sky Cricket, which we subscribe to. But we done really well against New Zealand.
Yes, it's on uh, what was BT Sport, isn't it?
Yeah,
I do
which
have
we
that.
don't
Yeah,
subscribe to. So
yeah.
we have to keep up with it, online really.
I've watched some of that. It's been good. Yeah, no, they're playing. Everyone's beating everyone else in Test cricket at the moment, which is yeah, interesting.
Although I
So
never get my hopes with England, because you know what we're like. We'd be like absolutely brilliant in one match, and then what the hell happens in the next one? So my expectations are fairly evenly managed, I think. Anyway, on that
very good.
note,
Yeah.
I'm going to say have a lovely Christmas, happy cricket watching.
Yeah.
And listen, we'll be back on the 9th of January with our next podcast.
9th of Jan.
Probably fatter, hopefully happier.
Yeah, I will
And
be
look-
so relaxed, it's untrue. Or I'll be on edge because I'll be thinking, God, what on earth am I going to do now? I've had enough cricket, I've had enough darts, I've had enough of my family. But my family have had enough of me, more to the point, really. All right, then.
Okay,
See
bye
you then.
everyone.
Thanks a lot.